I was 32 when I decided to take a break from work and head up to a cabin in northern Vermont. This was back in October of 2019. I'd just come off a long, stressful stretch at my job in Boston, working on a construction project that had gone sideways in more ways than one. I was tired, mentally drained, and needed some real quiet. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear traffic, didn't want to look at my phone. Just trees, maybe some birds, and my own breathing. That's what I was chasing. I found the cabin through a rental site. It was small, older, one bedroom, buried deep in the woods about an hour outside a town called Jay. The photos showed a wraparound porch, a little fireplace, and no visible neighbors. That was a selling point. I wanted space, solitude. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, a cooler full of food, a few books, a knife, a flashlight, my phone, mostly for emergencies, and some basic tools. I borrowed a friend's 4Runner because my car wouldn't make it on the dirt roads up there. The drive was long and quiet, and the deeper I got into Vermont, the more I relaxed. The leaves were mid-turn, red and orange patches spread across the hillsides. The air started to cool. It felt good to be heading somewhere off the map. I got to the cabin just before dusk. It sat at the end of a long, narrow road that looked barely maintained. The trees on either side were thick and tangled, and the path was just 2 tracks of dirt with grass growing between them. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something out of the 1960s. Weather-worn wood, moss on the roof, and an old rusted shovel leaning against the porch railing. The windows were small and dusty, but the place had character. More than I expected, honestly. I parked the SUV close to the porch and walked up the creaking steps. The key had been left under a rock near the door, just like the owner told me. I unlocked it and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and cold air. Everything inside was simple: wood floors, a small couch, a table with 2 chairs, a bed with a wool blanket in the corner, and a fireplace made of stone. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just what I wanted. I walked through the place slowly, opening drawers, checking the cupboards. There were a few basics: matches, an old can opener, a stack of firewood inside near the fireplace. Everything was quiet, still. I unpacked, got a small fire going, and heated up some soup on the old propane stove. That night, I sat in a creaky chair near the fire and read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The silence out there was unbelievable. No cars, no people. Just the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. The first 2 days went by like that. I took walks down a trail behind the cabin, read, cooked simple meals, and slept deeply at night. My phone stayed off. I started to feel like I was resetting something in my head, like I was finally breathing differently, lighter, calmer. On the 3rd day, things shifted. It started with something small. I woke up and noticed my boots, which I always left by the front door, were turned around. Not far, just pointing the wrong way. I figured maybe I'd kicked them in my sleep or something. Didn't think much of it. Later that morning, I walked out back and noticed something strange near the edge of the woods. A patch of overturned earth like someone had been digging. The soil was loose, and there were shallow claw-like marks through the leaves and dirt. But no paw prints, no animal tracks at all. Just loose dirt and dragged lines. I crouched down to look closer. The lines weren't clean like from a shovel, more like they'd been scraped. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Then I brushed it off, thinking maybe a deer had kicked around or something. I tried to let it go, but over the next day, more things happened. That night, I went to get more firewood from the pile outside. I'd stacked it neatly when I arrived, but now it looked like someone had pulled pieces out and tossed them aside. A few were broken. I stood there in the dark, holding my flashlight, just looking at the mess. It didn't feel like an animal. It looked too deliberate. I told myself it didn't matter and just brought a few logs inside. But that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, sticks cracking outside, what sounded like light footsteps circling the cabin. I got up around 2 a.m. and stood by the window, peeking through the dusty glass. The trees were still. The moon was out, but I had that sick feeling you get when someone's watching you. I tried to go back to sleep, but I left the fire burning lower than usual and kept the flashlight near my hand. The next morning, I found more signs. The cooler I kept on the porch had been moved about 3 feet from where I left it. It wasn't opened, but the latches were scratched. I started walking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for prints, signs, anything, but the ground was mostly dry leaves, and nothing looked obvious. I didn't want to sound crazy to myself, but I started locking the door even during the day. I kept my knife in my pocket at all times and brought the flashlight even when I just stepped out to use the outhouse. I was on edge. I still hadn't seen anyone, but it felt like something wasn't right. That evening, I decided to stay inside and keep watch. I pulled the chair to the window that faced the trail and sat there for hours. The fire was low, and I kept all the inside lights off. Just me, the chair, and the woods in front of me. Around 1 a.m., I saw movement. It was faint, maybe 30 yards out, near where the trail disappeared into the trees. Something moved between the trunks. Not an animal.
Taller.
Slower. I squinted through the glass, barely breathing. Then I saw it again. A figure, just barely visible, standing still between the trees. Not moving forward, just watching. I couldn't see a face, couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. It was too dark, but it was a person. I was sure of it. I didn't move. I sat there for at least an hour watching the same spot, but the figure didn't move again. I eventually crept back to the bed and laid there with the flashlight pointed at the door. In the morning, I walked to where I'd seen the figure. I didn't see tracks, but I saw something else. Hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground was a strip of cloth. Faded blue, like from a shirt or pants. It was tied loosely, like someone had looped it there on purpose. I didn't touch it, just looked at it and backed away. That afternoon, I started packing. I told myself I'd planned to leave the next day anyway, but that was a lie. I was rattled. I didn't know what I'd seen or who was out there, but I didn't want to wait and find out. I didn't eat lunch, just packed, cleaned up the inside, and made sure everything was ready to go. Then the Forerunner wouldn't start. I turned the key and it clicked once. Then nothing. Tried again. Nothing. The lights on the dash flicked once and went dead. I opened the hood, checked the battery, wires, everything I knew how to do, but I couldn't get it running. I had no cell signal, no internet, no landline in the cabin. The nearest town was about 10 miles down a dirt road with no guarantee I'd find anyone. And it would be getting dark in a few hours. I spent the evening inside, tense and cold. I had no way out until morning, and I didn't want to walk that road in the dark. I sat near the fireplace with the knife in my lap and barely blinked. Every sound outside made me jump. At some point past midnight, I heard something on the porch. Not footsteps, a dragging sound, then a thump, like something was placed or dropped near the door. I didn't move. I just stared at the door for the next hour. I didn't hear anything else. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside. Sitting on the porch right next to the door was my flashlight. I hadn't brought it out there. I kept it inside the whole time. It was covered in dirt and leaves. I picked it up slowly. Still worked, but the lens was cracked. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, locked the cabin, and started walking. I walked the 10 miles without stopping. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. I didn't see another person the whole time. When I got into town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. They drove up with me in a cruiser later that day. We found the cabin untouched. The inside looked just as I'd left it. The cloth was still hanging from the tree, but they didn't seem concerned. They checked the Forerunner and found the battery completely drained. More than it should have been. No signs of animals. No prints. They told me it was probably a vagrant passing through, maybe someone squatting out in the woods, but there was no evidence to follow up on. I took a bus back to Boston the next day. I never went back to the cabin. The owner emailed me to ask how it was, and I never replied. I told myself maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe someone passing through really did just happen to be near the place. But I can't stop thinking about the flashlight. I never brought it outside. I'm sure of that. And someone left it there, right next to the door, like they wanted me to know they'd been watching. I've never stayed alone in the woods again. I still go out sometimes, but only with friends and never too far from a road. That week in Vermont gave me exactly what I asked. I was 31 the summer I took a week off from my job in Omaha and decided to stay in a remote cabin in northern Idaho. It was 2022, and things had been weighing on me heavily. Work, a messy breakup, and just the kind of stress that slowly eats at you day after day until you don't remember what it feels like to wake up without tension in your chest. A friend of a friend had mentioned a small cabin he rented once, tucked deep in the forest near Priest Lake. No cell service, no internet, and nothing around for miles except trees, hills, and sky. That sounded perfect. I booked it without thinking twice. The drive there took almost 16 hours, most of it on winding roads that got more narrow and broken the farther north I went. The last 2 hours were on a gravel road with barely enough space for my SUV. The trees on both sides leaned in so close their branches scraped my windows. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, small, wooden, and dark brown, with a slanted tin roof and a narrow porch covered in pine needles. There was a woodpile stacked neatly to the side, and a rusted axe embedded in a stump beside it. The air smelled like damp moss and old leaves. The place looked like it had been built 50 years ago, maybe more. I parked on a patch of flattened grass and shut off the engine. The silence hit me harder than I expected. No cars, no humming of air conditioners, no people. Just the faint creaking of trees and a far-off bird call. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. Inside the cabin, things were simple. One room with a small bed, a narrow table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove. There was a bathroom off to the side with a composting toilet and a tiny sink that only worked when I turned a hand pump connected to a barrel outside. The kitchen area had a propane stove, a few dusty dishes, and a cooler where I'd keep perishables with ice I brought in. There were 3 windows, one above the sink, one beside the bed, and one looking out to the trees in back. Each window had a latch but no screens. I brought in my bags, set up my food supplies, and took a long breath. I felt better already. I had paper, some books, and my trail shoes. I planned to read, hike, maybe write a little. The first night was calm. I made some soup on the stove and sat on the porch while it got dark. The stars were clearer than I'd seen in years, packed across the sky in heavy clusters. I kept a flashlight beside me and left the cabin door open. It cooled off fast after sunset, and the trees creaked in the wind like old doors shifting on their hinges. I went to bed early, and I remember falling asleep fast. The bed was firm but comfortable. It smelled like cedar and dust. I woke up once around 2 a.m. and realized how truly dark it was. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I heard an owl or something far off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I felt good. I made oatmeal and coffee on the stove and packed a small bag to explore the woods. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led up a ridge. It wasn't marked, but it seemed like someone had used it before. Boots had worn a faint trail, and there were broken branches pushed aside. I walked for maybe 2 hours, climbing higher and deeper into the trees. The farther I went, the quieter it got. At one point, I stopped and realized I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no bugs, just silence. I felt uneasy for the first time, but I shook it off. Maybe I was just not used to being this far from everything. When I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I was sweaty and tired. I sat on the porch again, drank water, and noticed something strange. The axe was no longer stuck in the stump. It was on the ground beside it. That made me pause. I was almost certain I hadn't touched it. I stared at it for a long time, then picked it up and wedged it back into the stump. I told myself maybe I had knocked it over when I unloaded the car or brushed past it. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. The silence outside felt heavier now, like it had weight. On the second night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned all around. I heard branches falling somewhere in the distance. Around midnight, I heard something closer, like crunching leaves near the side of the cabin. I froze in bed, holding my breath. It sounded like footsteps, slow and uneven. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, not moving. I didn't hear them again. In the morning, I went outside and checked. There were no prints I could clearly see, just some disturbed needles and a broken twig near the back window. I didn't know what kind of animals lived out here, but I figured it might have been a deer or something. Still, I felt different after that. I stopped leaving the door open. I started keeping the hatchet inside at night. I kept my flashlight close, and I looked out the windows more often, watching the trees. On the third day, it rained hard. I stayed inside most of the day reading. I cooked some rice and beans and tried to write a little in my notebook, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept hearing sounds outside, like sticks snapping, sometimes soft thuds. I'd get up and look, but I never saw anything. The rain made it worse, blurring the windows and muting sounds in strange ways. That night, I heard something again. This time it was clearer, definitely footsteps. They walked slowly across the porch. I didn't move from the bed. I listened, heart pounding. Then they stopped just outside the door. I didn't breathe. I waited. No knock, no voice, just silence. Then the footsteps moved again off the porch around the side. I sat up and reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited in the dark. Eventually, the sounds faded. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. One of the chairs on the porch was moved. It had been pulled back like someone had sat in it, and the axe again was on the ground, not just lying flat, but leaned carefully against the stump. I knew then it wasn't an animal. I checked everything, my car, the food, my bags. Nothing was missing, no signs of forced entry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even close by, in the trees, seeing everything I did. I thought about leaving, but part of me felt like I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anyone, no real proof, and the rental wasn't refundable. I told myself to be more careful. I brought the axe inside. I blocked the door with one of the chairs. I kept the flashlight in my lap while I read. The next night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rain, no animals. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed for most of the night, straining my ears. Nothing happened. But just before dawn, I saw something that chilled me to my bones. Someone had scratched a line into the glass of the window beside the bed. A single, shallow vertical line, maybe an inch long. I hadn't heard anything. Whoever did it had been inches from where I slept. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the money. I didn't eat, didn't take time to clean. I just shoved my stuff into bags, locked the door behind me, and started the drive back. The gravel road felt even longer this time, like it would never end. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, certain I'd see someone step out from the trees. When I got to the main highway, I finally relaxed a little. I drove all the way to Spokane before stopping. I booked a motel near the airport and stayed the night. I didn't sleep well. Every noise made me jump. I kept the lights on. When I got home to Omaha, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said the cabin was too isolated and not for me. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office in Bonner County. They found my contact info from the rental owner. A hiker had come across an abandoned tent and campsite less than a mile from where the cabin sat. It had rotted gear, some old clothes, and a journal. Inside the journal were entries from someone who said they were watching a man in a cabin and waiting for him to leave so they could go back in. The sheriff asked me if I had seen anyone or heard anything strange while I was there. I told him no. He said they didn't find a body, just signs that someone had been living out there for a long time, off-grid, completely hidden. They figured it was someone with mental issues who had been squatting in the woods and didn't want to be found. I think about that every now and then. I think about how close that person must have been to me, maybe just out of sight behind a tree, watching me through the windows, moving things when I wasn't looking, walking around the cabin while I slept. I think about what would have happened if I stayed just one more night. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stayed in another cabin either. I don't think I ever will. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name is Ethan. I was 29 back then, and I had been working nonstop in the city for years. The constant noise, the deadlines, the crowded subway rides. Everything wore me down. I wanted a place far away from the city's chaos. I found a small cabin for rent in a remote part part of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. The owner said it was quiet, peaceful, and the perfect place to recharge. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from Albany, along narrow, twisting roads that cut through dense pine forests. When I first saw it, it was just before dusk. The sun was dipping low, the sky painted orange and purple. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by tall pine trees, their needles swaying softly in the cold autumn breeze. It was an old wooden structure, maybe built in the late 1950s or early 1960s. The wood was weathered and gray, but sturdy. It had a porch with a creaky wooden swing, a small stone chimney, and 2 windows that looked out over the thick forest behind it. I unpacked my things slowly. I brought only the essentials: some clothes, a lantern, canned food, a small first aid kit, and a few books. No TV, no phone signal, no internet. The silence was immediate and total. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own breathing and the faint crackling of the dry leaves outside. The first night was calm, if a little chilly. I had brought a wood stove, and after chopping some wood from a small pile near the back of the cabin, I managed to get a fire going. The warmth filled the small room, and the flickering flames cast shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I remember feeling a deep kind of peace, like I was finally far enough from the city to breathe freely. The next few days were spent exploring the woods. I walked along narrow trails, crossed small streams, and watched squirrels and birds go about their business. The forest was beautiful, painted with the fiery colors of fall, reds, oranges, and yellows blending with the dark green of the pines. I collected some dry kindling, filled a bucket with water from a nearby spring, and kept my routine simple: eat, read, sleep, and wander. On the 3rd day, I started to notice something odd. Small things at first: a broken branch on the path, like something heavy had pushed through it. The footprints around the cabin were a little strange too. There were deer tracks, sure, and some from raccoons, but some prints looked different, larger, heavier, like boots maybe. But I hadn't seen a soul around for miles. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunters had passed through earlier in the season, or someone was hiking nearby and I hadn't met them yet. The forest can play tricks on you when you're alone, I thought. Your mind fills in the gaps. But that night, the sounds grew stranger. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping just outside the cabin window. The moon was bright and full, and I could see the long shadows of the trees. I stayed frozen, listening closely. The snapping came again, slow and deliberate, not like an animal running or jumping, but like someone walking carefully but with purpose. I didn't dare look out. I was alone and I knew it. The door was locked, the windows shut tight. I lit the lantern and sat by the fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The next day, I found more signs. On the porch, the wooden swing was pushed aside. It had been hanging still when I left the night before, but now it was pushed right against the wall. There were new footprints in the soft earth near the cabin, large, booted prints that led into the forest and didn't return. I felt trapped. For a moment, I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was still early, and I'd come so far to get away. I told myself to stay calm. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows again. I gathered a few knives from my kitchen and kept them close. That night, the sounds came again. This time, there were whispers outside. Not loud, not clear words, but a low murmur, like people talking just beyond the trees. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering, but I forced myself to stay quiet and still. The whispers faded after some time, and the forest fell silent again. The following morning, I decided to explore farther away from the cabin. I wanted to see if I could spot anyone or any signs of people nearby. I packed my backpack with water, some food, and a flashlight, and headed down a trail I hadn't taken before. The forest grew thicker and darker. The tall pines blocked much of the sunlight, and the air smelled damp and earthy. After about an hour, I came upon a clearing with an old, rusted car half buried in leaves. It looked abandoned for years. Nearby, there were signs of a campfire, charred wood and ashes cold to the touch. I felt a chill. Someone had been here recently. Someone had used this spot as a camp. Maybe it was the same people I heard last night. I took photos with my small camera. I wanted proof of something, anything. I kept moving, but as I turned to head back, I heard a sound behind me, like a low grunt or a breath. I spun around quickly, but nothing was there. The forest was still and quiet again. I rushed back to the cabin, heart racing. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. Over the next few days, the strange things increased. At night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. I found strange marks scratched into the wood of the porch, deep gouges, like someone had pressed a knife into it. My food supplies were disturbed. Cans were moved, and I found small scraps of cloth caught on the bushes near the windows. I never saw anyone clearly, only glimpses of shadows between the trees. No voices, just heavy breathing and the crack of twigs underfoot. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. On the 5th day, I decided to leave at first light. I packed my gear quickly, feeling the weight of every second I stayed. The sky was gray and heavy with rain. Before dawn, I checked the door and windows one last time, then stepped outside. I noticed fresh footprints leading from the woods directly to the porch. They were new. Someone had been watching me. I walked briskly to my car. The forest around me seemed alive, tense. Every crackle of leaves underfoot sounded like a warning. My hands shook as I got in and locked the doors. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the trees. A figure standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed on the gas and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. The drive back to the city was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But I didn't. Back in my apartment, safe and warm, I thought about what happened. The fear, the silence, the constant feeling of being watched. I never figured out who or what those people were, or why they chose to stalk that remote cabin. But I learned something important. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're just people. People who choose to stay hidden in the woods, watching, waiting. And when you're alone, they become your worst nightmare. I never went back to that cabin, but the memory of those nights, the sounds, and the feeling of helplessness stayed with me. I understand now how real fear works, how it's not about what's imagined, but what's real, right outside your door. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 33 years old at the time, working as a mechanic in a small auto shop in Erie, Pennsylvania. Life had started feeling like it was happening in fast forward. Same routine every day, same people, same noise. I needed to slow things down. I had a week of vacation saved up, and I thought I'd use it to go somewhere quiet, away from traffic, cell service, and people in general. I booked a small cabin through a rental site. It was located deep in the Allegheny National Forest, almost 2 hours away from any proper town. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi or phone signal and ran on propane and solar panels. The idea of total quiet sounded perfect to me. I packed a duffel with clothes, some food, and a few basic tools just in case. I also brought a small generator and a jerry can of gas. I wasn't expecting to use it much, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have a backup. The drive up was mostly uneventful. I stopped once at a gas station in Warren to grab a sandwich and some extra water. After that, the road got narrower, more broken up. Potholes, overgrown trees, no painted lines. The last 5 miles were dirt road, no signs, just the occasional tire rut. It took me nearly 30 minutes to cover that last stretch. I remember thinking how isolated the place felt even in daylight. But I liked it. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was just how it had looked in the pictures. Small, dark wood exterior, one window in the front, another in the back. A metal roof, a covered porch with an old rocking chair. A shed stood about 30 feet to the right, mostly surrounded by trees. No neighbors in sight, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. Inside, it was simple but decent. A main room with a bed, small table, and a wood stove. A kitchen space with a propane-powered fridge and stove. A tiny bathroom in the back with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower system. There were a few canned goods in the cupboard and some old pots and pans. The floor creaked a bit when I walked, but the place felt solid. That first night was peaceful. I made some scrambled eggs and toast, read a paperback I'd brought, and went to bed early. The silence was strange at first. I kept expecting to hear something mechanical. A car, a plane overhead, but there was nothing. Just wind, owls, and the occasional creak of wood expanding and settling. The second day, I took a hike around the area. There was a faint trail leading north from the cabin, probably used by hunters or previous renters. I followed it for maybe 2 hours, just letting myself breathe and not think about anything. I saw deer tracks, some squirrel nests, even a rusted-out truck half buried in leaves and dirt. The forest felt old. Not wild exactly, but untouched, like it had grown without people for a long time. When I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something weird. The rocking chair on the porch was angled differently than I remembered. I hadn't touched it since arriving, but it was now facing outward, toward the trees. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had shifted it. It wasn't even that strong of a breeze, but I didn't think much of it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. There was a constant rustling outside, more than usual. I chalked it up to raccoons or maybe a bear passing through. I'd seen no signs of human activity nearby, so I figured animals were more comfortable wandering close. Still, it was enough to keep me awake for a while. I finally drifted off after midnight. The third day started fine. I made coffee using a small camp kettle and sat on the porch. I tried reading, but I kept glancing at the trees. Felt like something was off. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to check out the shed, which I hadn't opened yet. The door creaked badly, and the hinges were rusted. Inside were some old tools, an axe, a broken chainsaw, rusted nails, and a few lengths of rotted rope. There was a strong smell of mildew. I saw what looked like an old mattress folded against the wall. It had yellow stains and a ripped corner. I stepped closer and noticed scratch marks on the inside of the shed door. Long, thin gouges, not deep, but there were a lot of them. My stomach turned a bit. I stepped out and shut the door. That night was worse than the last. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not animal movements, clear, deliberate footsteps. Soft, slow, like someone walking barefoot. My blood ran cold. I froze in bed and didn't move. The steps circled the cabin once. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I went outside and looked around. No tracks. The ground was dry, covered in leaves. I checked the area around the porch, then walked toward the shed. The door was closed, same as I'd left it. I opened it anyway. Nothing had changed. Still, I felt like I was being watched. The trees felt closer than before, like they were pressing in. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I was just on edge from being alone. I tried to shake it off. I kept my hatchet nearby, though, just in case. That evening, I cooked early, cleaned up, and sat on the porch until it got dark. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the unease never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, into the trees. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in once the sun dipped below the ridge. I brought the generator inside that night and locked the door. I didn't want to go outside in the dark. I didn't even use the lights much, just one solar lantern by the bed. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything at first, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. Then I heard a tap on the window, just once. Then again, a slow, steady tap. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. The window didn't have curtains, just an old sheet tacked over it. I stayed still, clutching the hatchet. The tapping stopped. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch. That same slow step, one at a time. Felt like someone was checking the place, circling again. After maybe 10 minutes, everything stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to move. The first light, I went outside. Again, no tracks, but the rocking chair had moved again. Now it was facing the window. I stared at it for a long time, then turned and went back in. I packed up my stuff in silence. I was done. I didn't even eat breakfast. I didn't clean up. I just threw everything in the back of the truck, started the engine, and left. I didn't look back once. The road out felt longer than before. Every tree felt like it was hiding something. Every shadow made me flinch. Back in Erie, I told people I cut my vacation short because I got bored. That wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps or the tapping or the rocking chair. I didn't even write a review for the rental site. I just deleted the confirmation email and tried to forget about the whole thing. 2 weeks later, I was watching the local news when I saw a segment about a missing person. A hiker named Mark Powell, age 29, had disappeared in the Allegheny forest. Last seen near the northern edge of the park, right near where that cabin was. The report said his campsite had been found abandoned, but no signs of struggle. Just vanished. They showed a photo of him. He looked like any guy you'd see in a coffee shop. Smiling, normal. I stared at the photo for a long time. Not because I recognized him, I didn't, but because something about his eyes felt familiar. Not his actual eyes, but the look. Like he'd seen something out there too. I didn't sleep much that night. I haven't been back into the woods since. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The rocking chair, the tapping, the shed. I don't know if someone was living out there, watching people who rented the place, or if I was just the lucky one who left before something worse happened. I don't really need an answer. I just know I got out, and that's enough for me. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the Northwoods of Minnesota. I was 29 years old, burned out from the city's noise and stress. I needed silence and space to clear my mind, away from phones, people, and responsibilities. The cabin was a modest wooden structure on the edge of a dense pine forest, about 2 miles from the nearest road. I had never been out there before, but I found it listed in a small magazine for rustic cabins available for rent. The owner was an older man who only accepted cash and gave vague directions over the phone. That was enough for me. I arrived late afternoon, carrying my backpack and a small box of supplies. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, the tires crunching on gravel and dry twigs. As I walked up to the cabin, the sun was already starting to lower behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air smelled of pine and earth, mixed with a faint scent of smoke from some distant campfire. The cabin looked weathered but solid. The wooden boards were faded to a dull gray, and the windows were dirty but intact. A small porch with 2 creaky rocking chairs faced the forest. Inside, the cabin was bare but comfortable. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a rough wooden table and chairs, and a small bed covered with a thick quilt. There was no electricity, but a small box of matches and some oil lamps sat on a shelf. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly by the back door. I unpacked my food and supplies on the table and lit a lamp. The soft, flickering light filled the room with a warm glow. The first night was quiet, except for the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the faint crackle of branches under the feet of some unseen animal. I sat by the stove, reading an old paperback I'd brought, the fire giving off a steady warmth. Outside, the darkness felt thick and alive, but inside, I felt safe. On the second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense with tall pine and fir trees. The ground was soft underfoot, covered with pine needles and moss. I found a small stream about a 1/4 mile away, its water clear and cold, running over smooth stones. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, warming patches of the forest floor. I stayed there for hours, watching dragonflies hover above the water and listening to the gentle babble of the stream. That night, I built a fire outside the cabin. The flames licked at the dry wood, throwing sparks up into the sky. I roasted some canned beans and bread on a stick, the smell mixing with the pine smoke. The sky was clear, and stars filled the black dome above. I lay back on the rough wooden porch, feeling the night air cool against my skin, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. But things started to change on the third day. I woke early before dawn. The cabin was cold, the wind rattling the loose boards. I made a fire in the stove, letting it burn for warmth. Outside, the forest looked different, more silent. The birds were quiet, and even the usual rustling seemed to stop. I shrugged it off as just the natural stillness of the early morning and headed out to refill my water bottle at the stream. As I walked through the forest, I noticed something strange. The ground near the cabin had faint footprints, heavy, booted prints, leading from the road toward the cabin. They were fresh, no older than a day. That worried me a bit because the cabin was supposed to be completely isolated. Who else was out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I decided to stay alert but didn't want to panic. Maybe a hunter or someone else was camping nearby. I looked around carefully but didn't see or hear anyone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt too still, like it was holding its breath. When night came, I stayed inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. On the fourth day, I noticed more signs. Broken branches near the edge of the clearing. A discarded soda can lying half buried in the dirt. Someone had definitely been close. I didn't want to confront whoever it was, so I stayed inside most of the day, pacing and thinking. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that I had called a friend in the city before I left and left the address of the cabin with them. If anything went wrong, someone would come looking. That afternoon, I went outside briefly to chop some wood for the stove. The sun was warm, but the air was sharp and cool. While stacking the wood, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and stared, but there was nothing there. I finished quickly and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin felt smaller, more confining. The fifth day was worse. I heard noises at night, footsteps crunching around the cabin, maybe even the sound of someone breathing outside the window. The cabin's walls felt thin, and I could almost hear whispers carried on the wind, but I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. I stopped going out except when I had to. The isolation that was so peaceful at first became a trap. I started feeling trapped and panicked. The forest, once beautiful, now seemed hostile and dark. Then, on the morning of the sixth day, I woke to find the back door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic hit me hard. Someone had been inside the cabin. My heart pounded as I checked every corner. Nothing was missing, but I felt violated, watched, and vulnerable. I decided then to leave the next morning. That night, I barely slept, sitting up by the stove with an axe close at hand. In the early hours of the seventh day, just as the sky began to lighten, I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I locked the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and started walking back down the dirt road toward my car. As I walked, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They were too wide for a normal car, maybe a pickup truck or an ATV. I followed them for a while, the forest still and quiet. Suddenly, I heard voices in the distance. Men talking in low, harsh tones. I ducked behind a tree and saw a group of men unloading crates from a large truck. They didn't see me. The crates were heavy and marked with strange symbols, not ones I recognized. The men looked tough, rough, and armed. I realized I had stumbled onto something illegal, maybe poachers or smugglers using the forest as a hideout. My heart raced. I turned and ran back toward the road, faster than I had ever run. I didn't stop until I reached my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw the men gathering around a fire, watching the road. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I told the friend I had left my address with everything I saw. We contacted the local sheriff's department, but by the time they investigated, the men and their operation were gone. The forest returned to silence, but I knew what was hidden beneath its calm surface. That trip taught me how thin the line is between peace and danger, and how even in the quietest, most remote places, people carry their secrets, some darker than the shadows of the trees. I learned to trust my instincts and that sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. It was the summer of 1997 when I first decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I was 29 at the time, tired of the noise and stress of city life in Boston. The idea of escaping to a small, rustic cabin without any internet or phone reception sounded perfect. A chance to clear my head, get some rest, and reconnect with nature. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, built in the 1940s by some old family friend who had long since passed away, but it was sturdy with basic electricity and running water. I arrived on a quiet Monday afternoon. The weather was warm but not hot, the sun shining through tall pines and birches. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was rough and narrow, surrounded by thick forest on both sides. I remember the silence pressing in around me as I parked my old Subaru in the small clearing next to the cabin. There was no cell phone signal, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was a simple wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and 2 small windows on the front. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mothballs. The floor creaked underfoot, and the furniture was sparse but functional. A worn sofa, a small wooden table, a bed with a faded quilt, and a wood stove. I set my bags down, unpacked a few things, and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird or crow. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping firewood, exploring the nearby trails, and reading old paperbacks I had brought with me. Mornings were filled with the sharp, clean smell of dew and pine, and evenings fell early, casting long shadows through the trees. I enjoyed cooking simple meals on the small stove: beans, rice, canned vegetables, and fresh trout I caught from a nearby stream. The nights were cool, and I wrapped myself tightly in blankets, falling asleep to the steady crackle of the fire. But on the 4th day, something started to feel off. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., to the sound of twigs snapping outside. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush, but the sound was too deliberate and too close. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. The rustling continued, slow footsteps pacing back and forth just beyond the cabin's porch. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the thick trees. Nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no shape moving in the shadows. The sun was starting to rise, and the forest lightened to a dull gray-green. I told myself it was probably a stray dog or a hunter passing by, but something didn't sit right. The air felt heavier, and the silence that followed was almost too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, while gathering water from the stream, I noticed strange marks on the ground near the cabin. Footprints, but not quite human. The prints were larger than mine and deeper, almost as if someone was stomping heavily. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared where the underbrush grew thick. I had no idea who could be out there, and why they would be so close to the cabin without making themselves known. By the 5th day, unease settled into a dull ache in my chest. I kept hearing noises at odd times. Distant knocking on the cabin walls, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot when I expected none, the sound of breathing in the woods late at night. The forest around the cabin felt less like a peaceful refuge and more like a trap. One night, just past midnight, I woke suddenly to a sharp banging on the front door. My heart hammered as I stared into the darkness. No footsteps followed, no voice called out, just that heavy knocking. I didn't dare open the door. I stayed frozen, clutching a small hunting knife I'd brought along, waiting for the sound to stop. It did, after a minute or two, leaving an echoing silence that seemed even louder. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat awake until dawn, watching the windows and listening for anything unusual. The next morning, I found something on the porch, an old, rusty key tied to a scrap of cloth. No note, no sign of who left it or why. I didn't recognize it from anywhere. It felt like a warning or a message meant to unsettle me. I spent the next day packing a small bag. My plan was to leave early the next morning. But as evening came, the noises grew louder and closer. Scratches on the walls, soft thuds from the attic above, and again, footsteps circling the cabin like a predator stalking prey. I sat by the fire, my back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, trying to keep my shaking hands steady. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the windows. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Something heavy had been thrown against the back wall. I jumped up, grabbing my knife and flashlight, heart racing. I crept to the back door and looked outside. Nothing but shadows and trees. But I noticed something else. Someone had been there, right outside the window. Smears of dirt on the glass and what looked like a muddy footprint on the porch step. Fear swallowed me whole. I debated whether to stay or leave. The road was rough and steep, and the night was falling fast. But I couldn't stay and wait to find out what was lurking outside. Just as I was about to grab my bag and leave, I heard the soft sound of breathing very close behind me. I spun around, knife raised, but no one was there. My pulse thundered in my ears. I grabbed the bag, threw on my jacket, and ran out the door, down the porch steps, and into the dark forest. I didn't stop running. Branches slapped against my face and arms. Roots tripped me up, but I pushed forward. I knew the road was about a half-mile away, but the woods seemed endless in the dark. I tripped once and fell hard on my knees, scraping my palms and bleeding. But I got up and kept going. I could hear footsteps behind me, faster now, closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps. I thought about calling for help, but knew no one was around to hear me. The only thing I could do was keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto the gravel road. The moon had broken through the clouds, and I could see my car a short distance away. I ran toward it, fumbling with my keys, hands trembling so badly I dropped them twice. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark like blades. I drove away without looking back. As I hit the paved highway and turned on the radio, relief flooded over me. The normal sounds of traffic and voices felt like a shield against the darkness I'd left behind. The next day, I reported the strange happenings to the local sheriff's office. They said no one else had reported anything unusual, but they promised to check the area. Later, I learned from a neighbor that someone had been living illegally in the woods nearby. A man with a history of violence who had escaped from prison years before and was never caught. I never went back to that cabin again. The experience left a mark on me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting. Now, years later, I still think about that week, how the peaceful woods I longed for turned into a place of fear. But I'm grateful I got out alive, that I trusted my instincts to run, even when I didn't know what was chasing me. I keep the rusty key on a chain around my neck now, a reminder of how close I came to danger, and how important it is to listen to the quiet warnings the world sometimes gives us. I rented the cabin in late October of 2022, just outside of Marquette, Michigan. I was 33 years old, single, and trying to get away from a stressful job in Grand Rapids. I worked in IT, mostly remote, but burnout had hit me hard that year. I needed to unplug, get away from people, and just sit in silence. I'd been looking at cabins on rental sites for a while, and this one caught my eye because it looked remote and simple. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just a wood stove, a generator, and trees in every direction. It was a single-room wooden place with a loft for sleeping, maybe half a mile off a small dirt road. The guy who owned it was an older man named Harold. We only talked through email. He gave me directions, told me how to start the generator if I needed power, and where the key would be, under the flat rock next to the front steps. It was cold when I got there, mid-30s. The wind kept moving through the trees and the whole forest felt like it was breathing. The road that led to the cabin wasn't really a road, just a pair of muddy tire tracks through tall grass and brush. I drove my old Subaru in as far as I could before the trees narrowed in and I had to stop and walk the rest. I parked it maybe a 5-minute walk from the cabin and carried my bag and food cooler in 2 trips. No cell signal, which I expected. I left my phone in the car and told myself that was the point of all this, to disconnect. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. The wood was old, cracked in places, but it held the heat well enough. I didn't even need the generator the first night. The wood stove worked great. I sat in a chair by the front window, watching the trees go dark while the fire snapped behind me. I had brought a couple of books and a journal. I didn't plan on doing much but reading, sleeping, and maybe taking walks during the day. I fell asleep early that first night, and I remember waking up around 3 a.m. because the wind had really picked up. It made the whole cabin creak. I lay there listening to it and thinking how quiet the rest of the world felt without the hum of a fridge or the glow of a screen. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. The second day was just as quiet. I walked maybe a mile into the woods behind the cabin, following a deer trail. The land rolled gently, with lots of mossy rocks and birch trees. I didn't see another person or any signs of one. That night, I used the generator for a while so I could boil water for a real meal and run the light overhead. The quiet stillness was starting to feel a little thick by then. I had this moment sitting at the small table where I thought I heard something out beyond the trees. A sound that didn't quite fit. It was like a dry stick breaking, fast like a step. But I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer. There were signs of them everywhere, even close to the cabin. I finished eating, killed the generator, and went to bed early again. That third day is when things started to feel off. I woke up early and found that something had knocked over the trash bin I'd left outside. I'd kept it sealed and latched, but it was on its side, lit off, some wrappers and food scraps scattered. At first, I thought it was a raccoon, maybe a black bear, but the prints in the dirt weren't paws. They were boot prints. I stood there staring at them for a long time. There were two, one pressed into the mud near the bin, another a little farther off, but the pattern was clear. Treaded sole, left foot, no other signs around it. No drag marks or heel print nearby, almost like someone had stepped into the mud once and vanished. I tried to reason through it. Maybe a hiker passed through and I hadn't noticed. Maybe the trash bin fell on its own, and the boot print was mine from yesterday, and I just didn't remember. I tried to fit it into something normal because that's how we keep going when things start to wobble. I picked everything up, cleaned off the food scraps, and moved the bin inside the cabin. That night, I didn't use the generator. I didn't want to be lit up like a beacon. I sat in the dark with only the wood stove light and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every time a gust of wind shook the trees, I froze a little. I started thinking about how far I was from the nearest house or phone. There was no way to call anyone. My car was half a mile back down the trail. If something happened out here, I'd be on my own. That kind of isolation starts to feel like pressure. It builds behind your ears, and suddenly everything is too quiet, too sharp. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking I heard someone moving around outside, but every time I went to the window, I couldn't see anything. The moon was bright, which helped, but it also made shadows that looked like people. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the firewood I'd stacked neatly by the door was scattered. Not like it had fallen, like it had been tossed around. Some pieces were way out in the yard, too far to have just rolled. Again, no paw prints, just two more boot prints, spaced far apart, facing the door. I walked a wide circle around the cabin that morning, looking for signs of anyone. Nothing. No campsites, no old gear, no trail markers, just the woods. It didn't make sense. If someone was out here, where were they staying? And why mess with me without making contact? It didn't feel random. I started locking the door even during the day, even though it barely mattered, just an old deadbolt and thin walls. I took the firewood inside and moved my cooler in too. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the loft with the lights off, just watching the yard. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe to catch someone in the act, maybe to convince myself I was imagining it. But around 2:30 a.m., I saw movement. A figure came out from the trees to the left, just at the edge of the yard. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing something dark. It didn't run or sneak. It just stood there. I watched it from the loft, holding my breath, hoping it couldn't see me. It moved slowly toward the cabin. I could hear the leaves under its boots. When it got maybe 10 feet from the porch, it stopped. It stood there for what felt like forever. Then it backed away, step by step, and vanished into the trees. I didn't move until the sun came up. I packed that morning. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Just walk out and hope the person wasn't waiting? I stuffed everything into my bag, grabbed my cooler, and left. The walk to the car was tense. Every few steps I'd stop and listen. The forest felt different, still and watching. I made it to my car and threw everything in the back. As I went to close the hatch, I saw something in the dirt behind my tires. More boot prints, fresh, deep, like someone had been standing there watching the car. I drove out of there as fast as I could. The Subaru bounced down the trail, scraping branches, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I got to a diner outside of Ishpeming, sat in the parking lot, and just stared at nothing for a while. My phone had service again, so I turned it on. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even know what to say. I emailed Harold that night and told him something had happened, that I left early. He didn't respond. I didn't follow up. A week later, back in Grand Rapids, I started searching online for anything I could find about that area. No news, no reports, nothing. I looked up missing persons cases, just in case, but there was nothing nearby that matched. I looked up Harold's email domain, tried to see if the listing was still up. It wasn't. His name brought up no results. No cabin rentals, no local business listings. It was like he disappeared. I never told anyone the full story, not until now. And to this day, I don't know what the person out there wanted. They never tried to break in. They never left a note or made a sound. They just let me know they were there over and over without a word. What I do know is this: whoever it was had been watching me since I arrived. The boot prints weren't just random. They were placed, like they wanted to make sure I saw them. The trash, the firewood, the standing outside the cabin, it was all intentional. It wasn't someone lost or curious. It was someone playing a game. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Even now, if I walk in a park and hear a stick break behind me, I tense up. I look over my shoulder more than I used to. It's not paranoia, it's memory. Because once you know what it feels like to be watched by someone who never speaks, never shows themselves fully, and never leaves proof, they don't need to follow you. You carry them with you. And the scariest part is, whoever they were, they didn't want to hurt me. Not directly. They wanted me to leave. And I did. But what if I hadn't? That's the part that keeps me awake. Not what happened, but what didn't. What might have. What they were waiting for. I was 34 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. It was October 2022, right after a stressful contract ended at work, and I felt like I needed to reset. I booked the place online after reading a few decent reviews. It was a simple off-grid cabin, about 15 miles from the nearest town, with no electricity or running water, and only a small wood stove for heat. That was the appeal. No internet, no noise, no people, just trees and silence. The road leading to the cabin was more like a dirt trail after the last few houses dropped off. My old SUV made it most of the way, but I had to park half a mile out and walk the rest because the final stretch was too muddy and overgrown. I had packed light but brought enough food, water jugs, and gear to last 5 days. My cell phone had no signal once I got into the hills, which I expected. I had an emergency radio with GPS just in case something went really wrong. The cabin itself was even more basic than I imagined. It was built from dark, weathered wood and only had one room with a narrow cot, a small table and a few shelves. There was an outhouse about 20 yards behind it and a fire pit out front. The woods were dense all around, not a single clear view beyond maybe 20 feet in any direction. Still, the place was dry, quiet, and everything worked as advertised. The first 2 days were uneventful. I went on short hikes during daylight, cooked simple meals, read some paperback novels by lantern light, and spent time just listening to the wind in the trees. It was cool but not freezing, though I needed to feed the wood stove regularly to keep the cabin from getting too cold at night. There was a strange comfort in the solitude. I felt like I was finally starting to relax, like I was resetting my mind the way I hoped to. Things started to feel a little off on the third day, early in the morning. I woke up around 6 a.m. It was still dark, and I heard the steady sound outside, something crunching the leaves. It wasn't constant, more like short bursts of movement, then long pauses. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe a fox. I stayed still and just listened. After a while, the noise stopped, and I went back to sleep. Later that day, I took my usual walk down the trail that looped behind the cabin. The air was colder, and a thin fog had settled in through the trees. About a quarter mile into the walk, I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks, maybe 6 or 7, stacked in a little cone, was sitting in the middle of the trail. It looked out of place, too neat, too recent. I had walked that same trail the day before, and it definitely hadn't been there. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Could have been someone else hiking the trail earlier and playing around. Still, I didn't like how silent everything felt. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of my boots on the damp trail. I turned around earlier than usual and went back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small noise outside made me flinch. The wind scraped tree branches against the walls, and every now and then, I'd hear what sounded like quick footsteps crunching leaves and then nothing. I kept getting up to check through the small window, but it was just blackness outside. No lights, no shapes, just trees. I stayed bundled in my sleeping bag on the cot with my flashlight in my hand, trying to stay calm. When the sun finally rose, I felt relief, like I'd been holding my breath all night. I got dressed, stepped outside to clear my head, and immediately noticed something else. There were small indentations in the mud near the fire pit. Not animal prints, boot prints, human, and not mine. They were smaller than my size 11s, and they came from the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. Some were half erased by rain, but they were fresh. No doubt about it. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, maybe a hunter or a bored local. But I hadn't seen or heard another person since I arrived, and the nearest house was miles away. I walked the edge of the woods, trying to follow where the tracks went, but they vanished quickly on the drier ground. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I packed my bag and debated leaving right then, but the idea of hiking out through the fog, down the muddy trail, and then driving 15 miles back to the main road didn't sit right either. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just to see if anything else happened. If it did, I'd leave at first light. I made sure the cabin was secure that night. I blocked the door with a heavy chair, kept my flashlight and the emergency GPS close, and didn't light the fire so there wouldn't be any glow through the cracks in the wall. I even stayed dressed just in case I had to run. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. Soft, slow, not crunching leaves like before, but stepping on the porch boards. They were right outside. I didn't move. My flashlight was off. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped right at the door. For what felt like minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard the faint sound of the doorknob moving. Not violently, just testing it. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. They had to. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would echo through the walls. Then, after a few moments, the footsteps moved again. Slowly, back down the steps. Then silence. I stayed frozen in bed until sunrise. When it got light enough to see, I finally opened the door. There were boot prints in the frost on the porch. Same size as before. They stopped at the door and then turned back toward the trees. That was it. No signs of damage or anything left behind. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything into it, and left within 15 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't check the outhouse or the trail. I didn't look back. I walked fast through the woods, slipping in the mud, branches hitting my arms, until I reached my SUV. It was untouched, but I still felt like I was being watched the whole time. I drove until I had cell service, then stopped in a gas station parking lot to breathe. I never reported anything. What would I even say? There was no crime, no real evidence, just footsteps and a sense of something being wrong. I checked the reviews again for that cabin weeks later. The listing was gone. No trace of it online anymore. I I still don't know if someone else rented it after me or if the owner pulled it down for some reason. It's been over a year now, and I still think about those nights. About the footsteps, the quiet testing of the door, the deliberate way they circled the cabin. It wasn't random. Someone was watching me, waiting. I don't know for what. I haven't gone camping since. I won't again. I spent the first week of September 2019 alone in a cabin near Thompson Pass in Alaska. I was 31 at the time, burned out from work, and needing space from people. I didn't grow up camping or anything like that, but I'd read enough about solitude helping mental clarity, and I figured it couldn't hurt to unplug for a bit. My plan was simple. Stay in a rented cabin for 7 days. No phone, no internet, just some books, a notebook, and my thoughts. The cabin was old, but it had been refurbished recently by a local guy who listed it online as off-grid and ideal for thinkers. It sat on the edge of some thick pine woods about a 40-minute drive from the nearest store in Valdez. I drove up from Anchorage in a rented Subaru and got to the cabin late in the afternoon. The road that led to it turned from gravel into a rutted dirt track halfway through, winding between trees until it ended in a sort of clearing just big enough to park. The cabin itself was maybe 20 by 20 feet, made from weathered timber, with a tiny front porch, a slanted roof, and a tall metal chimney poking out the side. There was a generator out back, a small shed off to the left, and a beat-up woodpile stacked against the wall. Inside was sparse but comfortable. A small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with thick blankets, and a counter with some dishes and a propane stove. The man who owned it had stocked it with a few canned goods and left a large jug of drinking water. There was no running water, just a bucket and ladle system with a barrel that collected rain off the roof. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet away, just past the shed. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked my food, mostly trail mix, rice and soup, and made a pot of instant coffee. I spent the evening sitting on the porch watching the sun fall behind the tree line. The cold came quickly after dark, and I lit the stove and stayed close to it while I read. At night, I could hear wind moving through the trees, and once or twice I thought I heard distant snapping branches, but I chalked it up to animals. That first night, I fell asleep fast. The second day, I walked around the area, not far, just exploring maybe a half-mile radius around the cabin. There wasn't a trail, just thick forest and undergrowth. The ground was uneven and soft in some places, like it held too much water. I saw a few squirrel nests, some rabbit prints, and once spotted a black shape I think was a moose further out. No people, though. No other cabins. I was completely alone. That was the point. By the third day, I'd settled into a routine. Wake up, boil water, write in the notebook for a few hours, eat, take a walk, chop some wood, then read or just sit around until bed. I started to notice how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring after a while. No distant cars, no hum from electronics, no people talking. Just wind, the occasional bird, and whatever small things moved through the woods. That night, I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard something that wasn't the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel by the side of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. After maybe 20 seconds, it stopped. I waited another few minutes, then got up, moved to the window and looked out. I didn't see anything. Could have been an animal. Could have been the trees shifting. But something about the rhythm of the sound felt off. Too steady. I didn't sleep well after that. I kept one of the axes by the bed, just in case. When morning came, I checked around the cabin and didn't see anything unusual. No prints in the dirt. No signs of tampering. I told myself it had to be my imagination, or maybe a bear. On day 4, I noticed something strange. I had a small stack of firewood next to the door, maybe 6 or 7 pieces, and when I stepped out in the morning, one of them was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd burned more the night before than I remembered, but I was sure I hadn't touched that stack. It wasn't like the wind could have blown it away either. I searched around but didn't find it nearby. Just gone. Later that day, I went to the shed to get more wood. The lock was still in place, but the inside looked like someone had rummaged through it. An old tarp was pulled off the shelf, and a bundle of rope that had been coiled was now loose and lying on the floor. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. There wasn't any reason for it to look like that unless someone had been in there, but the shed was locked, and the only key was in my pocket. I was starting to feel it then, that crawling unease, like something was watching me just beyond the trees. I didn't go on my afternoon walk that day. I stayed close to the cabin, checking and rechecking the locks, going in and out of the door to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I stacked more firewood inside and locked the door earlier than usual. That night, I barely slept. Every sound felt loud. Every creak in the wood made me grip the axe a little tighter. On the morning of day 5, I found prints. Not animal ones, boot prints. They were faint, like someone had walked across the soft dirt maybe the day before. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the trees. I followed them for about 30 feet before the ground got too firm to keep track. I couldn't tell which direction the person came from or where they went, but someone had definitely been there. I didn't know what to do. I had no phone, no radio, no way to call anyone. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away, and even if I tried to drive back, I wasn't sure I could find the road in the dark if I needed to leave fast. I kept the axe close and stayed alert. I checked the windows constantly. Every time I stepped outside to get wood or go to the outhouse, I felt exposed. That afternoon, I decided to write everything down, just in case. I listed the missing firewood, the shed being disturbed, the footprints, the footsteps at night. I left the page open on the table. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I hoped whoever was out there would see it and leave me alone. Or maybe it was for someone else to find if things went badly. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the stove, axe across my lap, wrapped in a blanket. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving outside along the wall. This time they didn't stop. They circled the cabin once, then again. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. After maybe 10 minutes, everything went quiet. Then I heard the shed door creak open. The lock had still been on earlier that day. I was sure of it. I checked. I sat frozen, listening. No other sounds. Just that one long creak, then silence. I stayed in the chair until the sky started to turn gray. When it was light enough to see, I went outside with the axe in hand. The shed door was wide open. The lock was on the ground, broken. Inside, more things were scattered. The rope was missing. So was the small hatchet I'd left on the shelf. I felt sick. Someone had broken in during the night while I was just feet away. I looked around for more prints, and this time I found them clear as day. Boot prints leading away from the shed and toward the woods behind the cabin. I followed them. They didn't go far. Maybe 50 yards in, I found something that stopped me cold. A lean-to made of branches and bark. Roughly built, maybe 6 feet long, and covered in moss like it had been camouflaged. Inside were scraps of food wrappers, a plastic water bottle, and a shredded sleeping bag. Whoever had been near the cabin had been staying out there. I didn't go further. I turned around and walked fast back to the cabin. I threw everything into my backpack: food, water, my notebook, and got in the car. I didn't look back. I drove fast, bouncing over the dirt track until I found the gravel road again, then kept going until I reached the main highway. I didn't stop until I got to Valdez. I booked a room at a motel and stayed there for the night. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell the guy who rented me the cabin. I just wanted to leave it all behind. I drove back to Anchorage the next day and flew home. I think about that week more than I want to. I still wonder who that person was, what they were doing out there, why they came so close to the cabin without ever making themselves known. They didn't try to break in. They didn't leave any messages. Just watched, took things, circled. Could have been worse. I tell myself that often. Maybe they were just someone living off-grid, keeping to themselves, and I happened to get too close. Maybe they were testing me, or maybe they were waiting to see how I'd react. What I do know is this: I'll never go back to a cabin alone again. There are things in the woods that aren't ghosts or monsters, just people, and sometimes that's worse. It was the middle of October 2022 when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working in a small logistics office in Fort Wayne, Indiana, handling warehouse reports and late truck deliveries for the last 6 years, and I was burnt out. I was 33, single, and just exhausted from staring at monitors and tracking shipments. My eyes hurt. My back was always stiff. The job wasn't hard, but it never let up. I just needed some quiet, some time where I didn't have to answer emails or take calls or fix problems for anyone else. I'd been to Michigan's Upper Peninsula before, and I remembered how remote it felt. Endless trees, winding dirt roads, and that heavy silence you can only get far from other people. I looked around online and found a small rental cabin about 35 minutes north of Manistique, deep in the woods, past the main highway. It wasn't fancy. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a little wooden place with a tin roof, a propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and an outhouse a few yards out back. It was exactly what I was looking for, somewhere to shut out the world for a while. I left early on a Wednesday morning, just as the sun was coming up, and drove through Indiana and the lower part of Michigan until I crossed the Mackinac Bridge. By the time I got to Manistique, it was almost 4 p.m. I stopped at a small grocery store and picked up some basic supplies: cans of chili, beef stew, instant coffee, bread, peanut butter, a few gallons of water. I also grabbed a pack of wood matches, some batteries, and a box of granola bars. After that, I followed the emailed directions the owner gave me and headed north. The road turned to gravel after 15 minutes. Then, 10 miles later, it turned to dirt. The trees closed in, tall and thin and packed together, mostly birch and pine, and the land started to slope a little as I went further in. No other cars, no cell signal, just my old Ford Focus bouncing slowly over ruts, inching along at maybe 15 miles per hour. I passed a couple of hunting cabins, but they looked empty. Windows boarded up, no vehicles, no lights. Finally, I found the cabin I'd rented. It sat on a slight rise, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest, with a small clearing in the back that led to a shallow ravine. A narrow path led to a metal shed and an outhouse behind it. I parked, stretched my legs, and looked around. The place was smaller than I expected, maybe 25 feet wide, with a metal chimney sticking out the roof and a wooden porch that sagged slightly on one side. A pile of firewood was stacked beside the front steps. I unlocked the door with the key I'd been mailed, stepped inside, and just stood there for a while. It smelled like pine and old dust. There was a small kitchen to the left with a propane stove, a sink that only worked if you pumped the handle to draw from the rain barrel, and a counter covered in faded linoleum. To the right, a narrow door led to a bedroom just big enough for a twin mattress and a metal frame bed. There was also a fold-out couch, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner with a steel bucket for ash, and a few cracked windows with cheap curtains that hung stiff and crooked. It wasn't cozy, not exactly, but it felt like somewhere people didn't go very often, which was what I wanted. I brought in my stuff, unpacked, and lit the stove. It took a while to get the flame going, but I eventually had a little warmth. I made some coffee, ate a granola bar, and sat outside on the porch until it got dark. That first night was calm. It got colder than I expected, down to about 35 degrees, and I had to keep feeding the wood stove until midnight just to keep the cabin livable. I kept my socks on in the sleeping bag and used 2 blankets. I heard coyotes howling sometime after 2 a.m. and an owl close by, but nothing unusual. Just the sounds of the woods. The next 2 days were mostly the same. I walked a bit, sat outside, drank coffee, wrote in my notebook, read an old paperback I brought with me. I didn't see another human being. I didn't hear a car. The quiet started to get into my head a little, but I liked it. Time slowed down. My breathing got deeper. I stopped checking my phone, even though I knew I couldn't get a signal. The stress I'd carried for months started to loosen, but something changed on the 4th day. That morning, I woke up early and went outside to use the outhouse. The air was heavy, cold and wet, like it had rained a little overnight. There were more clouds than usual. I walked around the back of the cabin to grab another bundle of firewood, and I noticed something weird. The shed door, which had been shut tight since I arrived, was now open about 6 inches. It was a rusted metal door, and it made a loud squeal when moved, so I would have heard it during the night. I hadn't. I walked over and looked inside. It was just a storage shed with some broken tools, a rusted snow shovel, and a couple of paint cans. Nothing looked disturbed, but the door still bothered me. There hadn't been any wind. I closed it again, pulled hard until I heard it click, and went back inside. Around noon, I took a walk down the path behind the cabin. It curved through the woods for a quarter mile before sloping down into a gully full of moss and broken trees. I noticed something about 50 feet off the trail, a short tree stump that looked recently cut. But when I got closer, I saw it wasn't a tree at all. It was a piece of wood driven into the ground with a rough top, like it had been used as a post. Around it were marks in the dirt, half-circle indents like someone had stood there, turning in place. I looked around. I didn't see anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random. It looked like something someone had made or used. Not for firewood, not for camping, something else. That night, I kept the fire going longer and double-checked the lock on the door before I went to bed. I lay there, listening to the wind in the trees, and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Probably a hunter, I thought. Someone who'd used the woods long before I showed up. But the next morning, something was different again. There were boot prints outside the cabin. Not my own. These were wider, heavier. They came from the woods on the east side of the clearing, near the base of the hill, and led straight to the front porch. They stopped at the steps, turned slightly, and then went around the side toward the shed. There was no sign of them returning to the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The soil was damp from the night before, and the prints were clear, deep enough to show weight, tread marks that looked like work boots. I followed them slowly, heart thumping harder than it should have. When I got to the back corner of the cabin, I saw that the prints had circled the building completely, once, then disappeared back into the trees. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal, no one nearby, and I hadn't seen a car in days. I stood on the porch for a long time, just looking out into the trees, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was someone from a nearby cabin. Maybe it was old, but I knew it wasn't. The earth was soft. It had rained. These were from last night. That whole day I felt watched. Every time I stepped outside, I looked over my shoulder. Every noise felt sharper. A branch snapped behind the outhouse around noon, and I spun so fast I dropped the wood I was carrying. Nothing was there. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until I ran out of wood. I sat in the chair by the window with a flashlight and a kitchen knife on my lap, even though I knew how stupid that was. My ears were ringing with silence. I kept thinking I saw movement past the trees, but it was always just wind or shadows. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a slow, dragging step across the porch. Then another. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I felt sick. I clicked off the flashlight and leaned down under the window, pressing my back to the wall. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the wood creak again. Then the faint tap of something brushing against the front door. Not knocking, just touching it. I didn't breathe. I sat there for what felt like hours. I heard another creak, then nothing. No footsteps walking away, no voices, just the fire crackling low and slow. When the sun finally rose, I crept to the door and looked outside. There was nothing there, but the boot prints were back. This time they led to the door and stopped. No prints led away. I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag, tossed everything into the car without eating, and drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. My tires skidded a couple times on the loose gravel, but I didn't care. I just needed to be out of those woods. I made it back to Manistee by noon and pulled into a gas station, shaking. I sat there for 10 minutes before I could move again. When I finally checked my phone, I had over 60 missed notifications, emails, work messages, news alerts. I didn't answer any of them. I drove back to Fort Wayne that night, through the dark with the radio off. My hands never stopped gripping the wheel. I never found out who it was. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin and left footprints? But I know what I felt. I know how real it was. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I was 34 that summer, and I'd just gotten through a divorce that left me more tired than angry. I was living in Bend, Oregon, renting a small duplex and working remotely as a data analyst for a company based out of Denver. The work was repetitive and quiet, perfect for someone who didn't want to talk much. After months of emails, spreadsheets, and frozen dinners, I figured I could use a change of scenery. I didn't want a vacation in a big city or even a trip with friends. I just wanted to be alone somewhere peaceful. I found an off-grid cabin on a site for remote rentals. It was about 90 minutes outside of Bend, near a place called Crescent Lake. The photos showed a small, weathered-wood cabin surrounded by trees, with no neighbors in sight. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and only solar panels for power. It looked like exactly what I needed, total disconnection. The host's description said it had a bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. Water came from a gravity-fed tank outside. It sounded primitive, but that's what I was looking for. I booked it for a full week in late July. I packed up my Forester with enough food, water, a sleeping bag, basic tools, a solar charger for my emergency phone, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a few books I hadn't read yet. The drive out there started on normal roads but got bumpier the closer I got. The last 10 miles were gravel and dirt. I didn't pass a single car. Trees grew close on either side of the road, and the sunlight flickered through the canopy in a way that made everything feel a little timeless. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly how it looked online. Small, a little crooked in the way that old buildings tend to be, but standing solid. It was maybe 30 feet by 20, with a little porch on the front. The windows had thick shutters propped open with sticks. The inside was dim but cozy. A small wood stove in the corner, a twin bed with a thick wool blanket, some shelves stocked with canned goods, a propane stove, and an old metal sink that drained into a gray water barrel underneath. The gravity-fed water tank was mounted on a platform outside, already half full. After unpacking, I settled in quickly. The air was dry and smelled like pine needles and warm sap. At night, it got cold fast, and I learned quickly how to get the wood stove going. The silence was deep, the kind you can feel pressing against your ears. No hum of a fridge, no traffic, no voices. I didn't mind. That first night, I slept like I hadn't in months. The first 2 days passed in slow, easy rhythms. I'd wake up with the light, boil water for coffee, walk along the small trails behind the cabin, read on the porch, and cook simple meals. There was a small stream a few minutes down the hill where I'd rinse out pots or splash water on my face. I didn't see a single person. It was perfect. But on the third day, small things started to feel slightly off. It started in the late afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, reading, when I heard something heavy move through the trees behind the cabin. Not a squirrel or a bird, something larger, maybe a deer. I didn't think much of it at first. There was plenty of wildlife around. But it was the way the sound stopped suddenly that gave me pause. 1 second it was there, branches snapping, underbrush shifting, and then silence. I stood up and scanned the trees, but I didn't see anything. That night, I brought the flashlight to bed with me. I left the shutters cracked open for air, and the moonlight spilled in softly. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, just a sharp, cold sense that something wasn't right. I stayed still and listened. It was dead quiet. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like gravel crunching. Just once. Then again, closer. It stopped. I sat up and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the window. Nothing. I stayed like that, barely breathing, for several minutes. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't really sleep. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. There was a small patch of gravel in front of the porch, where my car was parked. I didn't see any clear footprints, but the surface was uneven and had plenty of indentations from past use. Could have been anything. An animal, a shifting rock. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard someone. That day, I went further down the trail behind the cabin. The path wasn't well worn, just a faint line through the trees. It eventually led to a narrow service road, overgrown and rough. I followed it for a few minutes, mostly out of curiosity, until I reached a small clearing where there was an old, rusted trailer sitting at the edge of the tree line. Its tires were flat, and moss covered most of its surface. There were no signs of recent activity, but the door was shut. I didn't approach it. Something about it just felt off. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. That night, the unease returned. I made a point to lock the door. Not that it would stop much since it was just an old latch, but it made me feel a bit better. I kept the flashlight next to me again. Around midnight, I was still awake, staring at the ceiling. That's when I heard the crunch again. This time, it wasn't just once. I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. They moved from the side of the cabin to the back. I sat up and turned off the small solar lantern I had hanging from a hook. I waited, holding my breath. Then, I heard it, the faintest creak like weight on the back porch step. It was so quiet that it could have been imagined, but I didn't think so. I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it through the back window. Nothing. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, still nothing. Eventually, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The forest was silent. I made a full circle around the cabin, flashlight beam swinging slowly over trees, brush, and gravel. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. There was a small pile of pine cones arranged on the porch rail. 5 of them stacked in a little pyramid. I hadn't put them there. I would have noticed something like that. I stared at them for a long time. Then I knocked them down and swept them into the dirt. I didn't know if it was someone messing with me or some kind of animal thing, but I felt exposed, like someone had come right up to the edge of where I slept. I spent the next few hours debating what to do. I still had 2 days left on the booking. Part of me wanted to stay. I didn't want to scare myself into cutting the trip short. But the other part, the louder part, told me I shouldn't ignore this. Something was happening. Whether it was a person or something else, it wasn't right. I made a plan. I would sleep in the cabin that night, but I'd park my car facing the road, with everything packed. If anything else happened, I'd leave immediately, even if it was in the middle of the night. I tried to distract myself during the day, went on another long walk, read, cooked, but everything felt off. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept checking the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling wouldn't leave. That night, I didn't turn the lights on. I stayed fully dressed, laying on top of the bed with the flashlight in one hand and a knife I'd brought for food prep in the other. It was a long time before anything happened, but it did. Just after 3 a.m., I heard something scrape along the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, then footsteps on the porch. Heavy, clear. The sound of someone standing just inches from the door. I didn't move. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might give me away. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The click of the latch being tested. Just once. Then silence. I bolted up, grabbed my bag, and slipped out the back door. I didn't use the flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. I moved fast but quiet, heart hammering in my ears, cutting through the trees to get around the cabin and reach the car. I jumped in, started it, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit paved road. When I finally pulled over, shaking, I checked the back seat, checked around the car. Nothing, but the fear was still there, wrapped around my ribs like wire. I didn't report it. What would I say? That I heard footsteps and saw a stack of pine cones? No one was hurt. Nothing was stolen. I just didn't want to deal with the questions. I never left a review, never contacted the host. I just went back to my rental in Bend and didn't tell anyone what happened. Weeks passed. I told myself it could have been a hunter, a squatter, someone camping illegally nearby. Maybe they thought the cabin was empty. Maybe it was some twisted local game. I don't know. I'll never know. But I do know I wasn't alone out there, and I'll never go back. It was the second week of October 2018 when I decided to spend a few quiet days in a remote cabin about 2 hours outside of Bend, Oregon. I had just turned 36 and felt worn out from the non-stop pace of my job as a commercial electrician in Portland. After back-to-back months of overtime and constant noise, I wanted silence, real silence. No cars, no phones, no people. Just trees and the sound of nothing. A friend of mine, Kevin, had a family cabin he never used. It was built by his grandfather back in the 60s and sat deep in the Deschutes National Forest, well off the paved road. Kevin gave me directions and the key. He told me it had no power, no running water, and barely any cell signal. It was what I was looking for. I packed my old Tacoma with a week's worth of canned food, water jugs, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, a hunting knife, a hatchet, a few flashlights, and some extra batteries. I also threw in a propane lantern, a small solar charger for emergencies, and a cooler packed with ice and a few frozen meals. I figured I'd read, hike, cook, sleep, and just take a real break from the world. That was all I wanted. The drive started smooth. I left just after sunrise, got coffee and gas, and made my way down Highway 97 until I turned off onto a long gravel road that led deeper into the forest. The trees thickened the farther I went, towering pines and firs rising on both sides like silent walls. My GPS lost signal about 15 minutes in, but I had printed directions from Kevin. I followed them carefully, counting the small trail crossings and landmarks he described. A big white boulder, a rusted old mailbox nailed to a tree, a sharp bend in the road near a dried-up creek. It all matched. Eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat right in the center of it, looking exactly like I pictured. Small, made of weathered logs, with a pitched roof and a front porch with two sagging chairs. One of the windows was cracked. Moss climbed up the sides and across the stone chimney. Behind it was a small outhouse, and beyond that, nothing but trees in every direction. I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The silence hit me right away. Not even birds chirped, just wind moving through the trees. Felt heavier than I expected, like the forest was holding its breath. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and musty. The cabin had one main room with a table, a wood stove, and a small kitchenette with old cabinets. A doorway led to a short hallway and a single bedroom at the back. There was a dusty mattress on a wooden frame, a dresser, and a mirror that had turned cloudy over time. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I swept, wiped down surfaces, and cleared out a few cobwebs. I unpacked what I needed and set up the lantern on the table. I chopped some kindling with the hatchet and stacked it beside the stove. By sundown, I had the place warm and cozy. I made a quick dinner of canned chili and crackers, read a bit by lantern light, and went to bed early. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke up a few times just from the silence. It's amazing how loud it feels when there's nothing at all, but I eventually slept. The next day, I went for a hike. I followed an old deer trail that led down to a small creek about a mile from the cabin. The trees here were thick and tall, and the ground was uneven with rocks and old roots. I filled one of my bottles at the creek and boiled the water back at the cabin. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, cooking, and writing a bit in a notebook I brought. It was peaceful. I didn't see or hear anyone. I didn't even hear a plane overhead. That night was calm again. On the third day, something started to feel different. I woke up just before dawn. The light coming in through the window was gray and cold. I got up to relieve myself outside, and as I stepped onto the porch, I saw something strange in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. There were tracks, footprints, human ones. At least they looked human, barefoot, deep, about 20 feet from the cabin, headed toward the tree line. At first I thought maybe I was seeing things. I walked over and crouched to look. They were fresh. No way they had been there the day before. The toes, heel, and arches were all clear in the soft dirt. Whoever it was, they hadn't been wearing shoes and they weren't mine. I had boots on every time I stepped outside. I followed the prints a bit. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin at a distance, then stopped. Just stopped. No prints going back. It was like someone came halfway around and vanished. I stood there, my skin crawling. I looked around at the forest. Still nothing. No movement. No sound. I called out once, not shouting, just a natural reaction. but the woods didn't answer. I stood still for a while, scanning the trees. Then I went back to the cabin and locked the door. That day I stayed close. I didn't hike. I didn't relax. I kept looking out the windows. Every few minutes I'd check again. I thought maybe I was just freaking myself out. Maybe it was a weird animal, or I had missed something logical. But deep down, I knew someone had been near the cabin, watching. That night I barely slept. I kept the lantern on. Every creak of the logs, every sound outside made me freeze. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I felt it. That sense that someone was nearby, watching. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time they were closer, right up to the porch steps. There were 2 new sets now, both barefoot, both coming from different directions. They met at the base of the stairs and then disappeared again. I checked my supplies. Nothing was missing. My food was untouched. The door was locked. But my sense of safety was gone. I thought about leaving, driving back to town and just forgetting about it. But something stubborn in me didn't want to give up the peace I came for. Maybe it was just someone messing around. Maybe a hiker who got lost. Maybe a kid from a nearby cabin I didn't know about. I told myself that a lot that day. I carried the hatchet with me the rest of the day. I kept it beside me while I read, while I cooked. I slept with it next to my sleeping bag that night. But again, I didn't hear anything. The next morning, the prints were gone. Washed away by wind, maybe, or whoever made them hadn't come back. I decided to stay one last night and leave early the next morning. I packed most of my gear that afternoon so I could leave at sunrise. That night, I kept the lantern on again. I lay in the sleeping bag fully clothed, boots on, jacket zipped. The hatchet sat beside me on the floor, and the flashlight was in my hand. I think I dozed off around midnight. I'm not sure for how long, but I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking. I froze. The door was locked. I had checked it twice. The sound wasn't loud, just a slow creak, like pressure on the wood. Then nothing. Then a faint shuffling sound, like fabric brushing across the floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. More silence. Then I heard one of the floorboards creak in the main room. I sat up slowly, flashlight aimed toward the hallway. I couldn't see anything through the doorway, just the edge of the wall and blackness beyond. Then I saw the shadow, just a shape, human height, not moving, standing just out of view. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, the shadow shifted, stepped backward, then silence again. A minute later, I heard the front door creak again, and then nothing. I stayed like that until the first light of morning. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. I didn't breathe. When it was bright enough to see, I finally stood up and walked slowly to the main room. The door was closed, still locked. Everything looked exactly how I had left it. But the floor had a single wet footprint near the table. Barefoot, right foot, toes pointed toward the hallway. I packed the rest of my things in under 5 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up. I just got in the truck and drove. The road felt longer on the way out. Every time I passed a turnoff or a bend, I expected someone to be standing there. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I didn't even check my phone until I was an hour outside of Bend. When I got back to Portland, I returned the key to Kevin and told him I appreciated the cabin but wouldn't be going back. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. I still don't know who it was, or how they got in, or why they didn't take anything or hurt me. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe someone lives out there, surviving off-grid and doesn't like visitors. Maybe they were just curious, or waiting. What I do know is that I felt something out there that I'd never felt before. Not fear, not even danger. It was something colder, like knowing you're being watched not because someone wants to hurt you, but because they can. I've never gone back into deep forest alone since. I still hike sometimes, but only in parks with other people around. I still love the silence of nature, but now I know that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just hiding something, waiting,